London, and welcome you all, and to all the online viewers watching the RTE watching today live stream. I'd like to welcome you all here for this first Imperialism on Trial event to free Julian Assange since our world was put in Sharkey in lockdown. We'd like to welcome you all in, and thank you for coming. Just like I said that if everybody, let's say everyone was practicing the social distancing in accordance with the church regulations, and I understand that there's some of you are exempt from wearing masks, and that is acceptable within the legislation, of the government legislation. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker here tonight. It's Mr. Chris Williamson, former Labour MP.
You shouldn't be having to hold a meeting like this because Julian Assange should not be incarcerated in Belfast prison the way in which he is now. I just wanted to talk a little bit really about the lack of political opposition to Julian Assange's treatment in this country. He states that there's opposition in the UK at the moment. And I don't know if any of you remember that last year the Foreign Office produced a video which suggested that journalism wasn't a crime. I kid you not. And some of the key extracts from it said, the Commonwealth Office said, you can't kill the truth. Everyone deserves access to information. It's vital to hold governments to account. This is the Commonwealth, Foreign Commonwealth Office. Freedom of expression underpins human rights. So that begs the question, why the hell is Julian Assange being held in Belmarsh prison right now in terrible circumstances? The man is being tortured on British soil, and we're not hearing sufficient voices in opposition to that. Now, regrettably, far too few MPs follow suit. I always think that, if you've got a platform, if you're not going to use it, what is the point of actually having that platform in the first place? And I've got to say, the real sad thing, the scales, if you like, have fallen from my eyes, is that politics in our country is broken in reality, certainly parliamentary politics anyway. House of Commons is overrun with establishment language, and what we need in Parliament is people who are genuinely going to represent the people that are voting there, genuinely going to speak out for what's right, genuinely going to speak truth to power, and we're not seeing it in the way in which we should be. And an example of that was the official opposition in the House of Commons just last week said that the Extinction Rebellion protests outside the corporate media was wrong. I say it absolutely was not wrong, it was absolutely the right thing to do, because our corporate media are doing this country a huge disservice, not just in terms of the way in which they're not reporting on Julian Assange's the Extinction Rebellion were protesting. It's a good thing, because they were saying that the corporate media have an obligation to speak about potential consequences of climate catastrophe in our country. And I remember some of the words that Jeremy has said. He said that in the last 50 years, virtually every war has been based and justified by media lies. The media does need to be held to account. And who are the people that should hold them to account? Well, the people that should hold them to account, in my opinion, are our elected representatives, our parliamentary representatives, and they're not doing their job, in my opinion, in that regard. When you look at the way Julian is being treated, there is a very clear, in my opinion, abuse of process. And we're not hearing again our parliamentarians, our political opposition in this country, speaking out about this abuse of process, because if you look at the actual extradition treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom, it very clearly states, Article 4, said that people cannot be extradited that that kind of should not go ahead. Well, if Julian's misdoing, his wrongdoing, so-called, isn't a political crime, I don't know what is. He has shone a light, has he not, on the abuse of state power, on war crimes by the United States of America. It's a very clearly political decision, and yet we're not hearing those voices of opposition in our House of Commons. When I was a Member of Parliament, tabled a motion in the House of Commons, it's a backbench motion, they're called early day motions, supporting Julian Assange. I have it here. It got just 5 signatures. The motion, if I can get my glasses, read as follows: that this House condemns the ongoing mistreatment and imprisonment of investigative journalist Julian Assange by the UK, agrees that the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and Treatment appears to contravene the principles of necessity and proportionality envisaged under human rights standards, opposes any attempt to extradite Mr Assange to the United States either directly from the UK or by onward extradition from Sweden, believes that his case has broad consequences for media freedoms, freedom of speech and civil liberties in the UK, and calls on the government to ensure that Mr Assange is released, that his physical integrity and freedom of movement are respected, and that he is afforded the right of compensation for his mistreatment by the UK. It got 5 signatures in our House of Commons. That's a disgrace when you think that our parliamentarians are there to represent us and to speak up for what is right. And more recently, another motion has been tabled by Richard Bergen in this Parliament, which read that this House notes that the July 2020 statement by the National Union of Journalists, the International Federation of Journalists, reporters without borders and others in relation to the WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and affirms its commitment to press freedom and public interest journalism. And only 22 parliamentarians have signed that. So we absolutely, I think, need to increase the intensity of our campaign, to increase the noise that we, as ordinary citizens, make, and the independent media has a huge torture of one human being. This has huge consequences, does it not, for all of us in terms of our rights to freedom of speech. And then, of course, when we're talking about the state of political opposition in this country, we look at the leader of the official opposition, Sir Keir Starmer. And Sir Keir Starmer is a pillar, as we know, of the establishment. And shortly after he was elected, he received a letter from the investigative journalist Matt Kennard. He posed 5 questions to Sir Keir. They still haven't been answered, and I'll just go through. It's worth it, I think, to get it on the record, because these are very pertinent questions which I think are in the national interest. And Matt Kennard asked Sir Keir, why did you meet the head of MI5 for informal social drinks the year after you decided not to prosecute MI5 for its role in torture? Bear in mind that Sir Keir Starmer used to be the Director of Public Prosecutions. When and why did you join the Trilateral Commission? And what was your membership of this intelligent links network entail? What did you discuss with the US Attorney General when you met him on the 9th of November 2011 in Washington, D.C., at a time when what role did you play in the Crown Prosecution Service's irregular handling of the Julian Assange case during your period as DPP? And why did you develop such a close relationship with the Times newspaper while you were the DPP? And does this relationship still exist? These are pertinent questions, and go to the heart, I think, of what is wrong with our opposition, political opposition in this country at the moment. We're seeing in Parliament and in the media the manufacturing of fear of Russia. We're seeing the Israeli apartheid regime. We're seeing again the government and indeed the official opposition in this country supporting the illicit opposition in Venezuela. Juan Guaido, who has no democratic legitimacy whatsoever, and yet he's been recognised as the president of the Venezuela. wrongdoings, on these abuses of power. And if the authorities are successful in driving their coach and horses through the extradition treaty, if they can get away with this abuse of process that we're seeing, if they can get away with torturing someone on British soil, then it sends a very chill message to anybody else who may follow in Julian Assange's place. And so our job, it seems to be, given the failure of our corporate media, given the failure of our politicians in the House of Commons, is to turn up the volume of the grassroots campaign. And we can still bring pressure to bear in a democracy, I suppose, so-called democracy, on our parliamentarians to do the right thing. We should be demanding that each and every member of Parliament speaks out in the House of Commons and calls for an end to what can only be described as a show trial of Julian Assange. They are accountable to you. They're accountable to us. And in speech, if the rule of law means anything, then Julian Assange must be set free. And we need to take that message from here and shout it from the rooftops and bring pressure to bear, as I say, on our parliamentarians until justice is done. We cannot let this lie. It's going to be down to us. We've got to get back to
Thank you very much, Chris. That was the second occasion speaking at Imperialism last year in my home private area in the north of Ireland. Thanks again, Chris. Can I call our next speaker, Dr. Catherine Brown Curtis? Dr. Brown Curtis. Humanities, English and Humanities New.
Julian Assange, who is currently suffering under a politically motivated legal case against him, a great advocate for press freedom and for holding power to account. Can we please express our support for Greg Murray? The media mediates. It isn't anything in itself. It transmits something else. In general, journalists do not want to be the story, persuade, distract, entertain, but not be the focus of attention themselves. This applies to Julian Assange as much as it applies to the journalists who hacked the phone of Millie Dowling. But sometimes the medium does become the message, and the journalist becomes the story written about by other journalists, as in both of these cases. We've seen Rebecca Brooks and others, and Julian Assange, arrested, put on trial, subject to huge amounts of journalistic attention, because in both cases the question of their methods overshadowed their matter. Their matter being, for example, that Millie Dowler's parents had left messages on Millie's phone in March 2002, or that US soldiers killed over a dozen Baghdadi civilians in July 2007. These things were revealed at the same time and involved some of the same people. For example, journalist Nick Davies was leading the investigations of phone hacking at The Guardian, whilst he was working with Julian Assange to publish the Afghan War Logs. And in those differences, I think we clearly see one of the ways in which our society has gone wrong. I'm going to be concentrating on newspapers, which have increasingly struggled since that time in their print format, but they retain considerable influence in their electronic form, setting the agenda for TV news and therefore for politics. Their domination by a few magnates who have influence over politicians parallels the situation in social media, where voices that hold the power to account are in cases. I'm going to compare them on First, the motivation and nature of the investigations. The phone hacking scandal happened as a result of exposure by other journalists from 2005 onwards. The phrase phone hacking describes only part, and arguably the least part, of what was revealed. Journalists bribing police for information, evidence-free and consequence-free destruction of individuals' reputations, media magnates' control of politicians and therefore of politics itself. The UK press had provoked 6 major investigations in as many decades, of which none prevented the need for the next one. It was public feeling, especially in response to the revelation in 2011 of the hacking of murdered schoolgirl Minnie Dowler's phone, that induced the Conservative government to set up the Levison inquiry. There were several arrests and convictions of journalists. News of the World's Glenn Mulcair was jailed for 6 months. Clive Goodman was jailed for 4 months. Previous News of the World editor, later CEO of News International, Rebecca Brooks, was arrested several times and finally tried on charges relating to phone hacking and perverting the course of justice in 2014, but was cleared. The newspaper's editor, Andy Coulson, after resigning from that post, was made Downing Street's Director of Communications and was not tried. Meanwhile, Levison's report into press culture came out in 2012, but under the inquiry's terms, this concluded only the first part of Levison's duties. Levison Part 2 was to involve criminal investigations of journalists and police, based on the findings of Part 1. In March 2018, the Conservative government announced that it was cancelling Levison 2. In other words, the government prevented a planned investigation of journalists' illegal activities and of police collusion with those activities, for which there was a strong prima facie case. In the case of Assange, as we know well, the government incited the more than suspect in ways that kept him in detention for as long as possible, and which involved shocking derogations from legal protocol and from the independence of the judiciary. The second point of comparison is the motivation behind the media coverage of these stories. In the case of the tabloid malfeasance, it's clear that many of the journalists covering it were motivated by the public interest. It should be added that their newspapers' proprietors didn't have the close relationship with the government that, say, Murdoch did, and therefore they had the story enabled them to assert their difference from the journalists they were denouncing. In the case of Assange, of course, those same newspapers, such as The Guardian, couldn't in good faith do that because they had themselves published materials given to them by WikiLeaks. But one gets the sense that they have since been trying to restore whatever relationship they had with the government, or responding to government pressure by their subsequent participation in Assange's character assassination, in which some of the journalists involved may have partly and anti-Russian grounds that have misled so many about Assange. But the contrast between The Guardian's relative fearlessness about a government embarrassment involving primarily domestic affairs and its compliance regarding one involving primarily foreign affairs, the Secret Services and the United States, is indicative of a new dynamic in government-media power relations. The third comparison is the attitude of the government to media scrutiny. The government has not enforced the recommendations of the Levison report, and if so, which replaced the discredited Police Complaints Commission in 2014, has continued in its ignoble and ineffective course. In 2019, former Conservative member of the House of Lords, Lord Fawkes, was, in complete contravention of the principles of press freedom, appointed the chair of IPSO. Most UK newspapers are signed up to IPSO, and the result is that most of the coverage of Levison has been hostile, and the press malfeasance which continues has dropped out of the news. Other newspapers direct about the character assassination of Julian Assange, including clear lies such as Assange's alleged meeting with Paul Manafort in the Ecuadorian embassy has no accessible recourse. Leveson had recommended that newspapers enter a low-cost arbitration scheme, allowing redress for victims of press smears without the risk and cost of libel proceedings. The failure to implement Leveson has left us without that recourse. Fourth, the motivation of the charged journalist's work. In the case of News International, The Mirror and the rest, the rank-and-file journalists were compelled by fear for their jobs and or ambition, and the editors and proprietors were motivated by money. Hacking the phones of 7/7 victims didn't further their political interests, but the power they had over politicians helped them in weakening the law's pursuit of them for doing this. In the case of Assange, the motivation was neither money nor any political motivation other than the public interest that is served by revealing crimes on the parts of states and other organisations. Revelations. One thing that did follow from the phone hacking scandal was that the material that was illegally obtained has been removed from the internet, so it can't now be found. But it was for the most part trivial, so that even when hacked individuals were celebrities, it would have been difficult to argue in those trials which will now not take place that the revelations were in the public interest. As opposed to, I should say, what the public is interested in. People may be interested in the fact that Hugh Grant briefly visited accident and emergency in March to us, but it is not in the public interest to know it. Feeling faint is not a crime. No crimes were revealed by the hacking. Assange revealed the most serious crimes possible, to the point of justifying the hacking with which Assange was wrongly accused of collaborating. Yet, post-Clive Ponting, the civil servant who leaked a damning truth about the Falklands War to the press, the public interest is in national security cases defined however the government sees fit. Sixth, the response of the majority for a year or two. Then the majority of the press regained the narrative, managed to conflate the freedom of the press to break the law without a reasonable justification with the freedom of the press per se, and smeared the characters of some of the leaders attacked on. The anger has now, as I've said, died down, though its causes remain. In the case of Assange, he was largely successfully demonstrated by the majority of the press. As a result, the wrong journalist is mistrusted, and the wrong journalist is revealing information of major importance. The way that the narrative of his alleged wrongdoing has dwarfed the narrative of proven major wrongdoing that he provided is astonishing. In both cases, similar dynamics seem to have been in play. My day job is teaching literature, and I'm well aware of the peculiarity of humans to crave narratives. Most of us are interested in the lives of real and fictional individuals in a way that we are not interested in systems and abstractions. The lives of the thousands of lives illegally destroyed in Iraq and Afghanistan, as Assange helped to reveal, seem to many to be abstractions rather than lives. Whereas Assange's alleged criminality is a story that can be followed. The countless journalists who helped corrupt our national life and the media political complex are, again, abstractions. Who leaked the Labour report into the handling of anti-Semitism claims? Who leaked the US-UK trade documents? This has the appeal of a whodunit. A history of Labour internal sabotage, or a future of increasing animal cruelty and falling food standards, doesn't. There is also in both cases a sense of passivity and futility. That of course Rupert Murdoch has influence over British politicians. Of course American soldiers commit war crimes. Of course modern technology gives the NSA and the GCHQ scrutiny over our lives beyond the wildest dreams of the Stasi. But people like Assange and Manning and Snowden may or may not get away with revealing latter crimes, therefore there is something to follow. And thus our interest is successfully should be followed. That is what many of us are here to do today for Assange. But for those following the stories without a grasp of the real abstract principles involved in them, the hero can be cast as a villain, whose suffering, as is true of all fictional villains, doesn't matter. But it doesn't always happen. The MP's expenses of 2009, that scandal dwarfed interest in how the documents that proved it got into journalists' hands. Recent animal activist exposés of conditions in British pig farms such as Hogwarts have attracted more attention than the illegal modes used to obtain footage. And it's worth mentioning here that WikiLeaks has revealed plenty about the new gag laws in the States, which criminalise revelations of illegal commercial animal cruelty, and against which there has been a considerable backlash, as there was when The Guardian in January this year published police documents classifying animal and environmentalist groups and Stop the War, along with far-right extremists and jihadists, for counter-terrorism response. 7. The response of a minority of the public to these two scandals. There's always been a small group of people who've remained focused on the crimes revealed in the phone hacking scandal and by Assange. In the first place, they campaigned for the prosecution of journalists who commit actual crimes in anything but the public interest. In the second, they, and that is we, campaigned against the prosecution of a journalist who, so far from committing a crime, has acted overwhelmingly in the public interest. These two positions support each other. Proper press regulation would distance the media from the state, protect proper journalism, and permit redress for character assassination, which is why the National Union of Journalists supports both causes. Unfortunately, not all of the leadership of HACTOB sees the connection between their cause and Assange's, but I'm working on it. To conclude, some journalists are obeisant to governments, some, like Murdoch, dominate governments, some, like Assange, hold them to account. Governments react accordingly and sometimes lean on the judiciary to enforce their response. But the revelation of this fact by other journalists can cause them embarrassment and for us all. Thank you.
He was a senior diplomat at the Ecuadorian Embassy here in London for 6 years while Julian was on a side in the embassy. So, thank you very much.
Yesterday, the final attack on truth journalism began. Two sides are at war. Yes, this is about the journalist who has most humiliated the greatest military and economic empire in history. But I would say this is about defending our freedom, expression, and communication. It is an equal, because on the side of the empire is not only the political and institutional power, but also the power of the big media and its mercy. Did someone see yesterday the coverage of the big UK television channels about the most important trial for freedom of expression of our generation? No, really. On the other side are you, the human rights activists, the worthy, courageous journalists who distinguish well freedom from submission, The human rights organizations, at last, Amnesty International, better late than never, and the human rights system, the UN human rights system, through the UN repertoire of persecution against Jews. This is basically a confrontation between war criminals and those who have exposed those criminals. This is a struggle between lies and oppression against truth and freedom. So, we should ask ourselves if this is as simple as that. Why is it so difficult for the truth to succeed? Why is that Julian Assange finds himself where he is now after more than 10 years of persecution, in risk of ending his life in one of those terrifying jails in America? We must be clear about what is behind the persecution of Julian Assange. It has nothing to do with national security, nor with state secrets, but rather has to do with the moral insecurity of the US to keep their state crimes secret. Anyone who dares to challenge American hegemony will be persecuted and destroyed to the extent we are witnessing at Albany Criminal Court nowadays. And the most modern and powerful weapon to persecute and destroy somebody is lawfare. Basically, the use, or rather the abuse, of the law and the judicial system as a political weapon. In Latin America, for example, lawfare is working wonders, criminalizing politics and politicians. This criminalization of politics explains what happened with Lula in Brazil, with Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, with ex-President Correa in Ecuador, persecuted and currently in self-imposed exile in Belgium, and with President Evo Morales now a political asylum. What do all these political leaders have in common? Well, they all defy US hegemony than Julian Assange. The point with Julian's case is that not only he has exposed the criminals and their crimes, but Julian also dared to face the other factual power, which is as damaging as the criminals themselves, the Western corporate media, whom Julian accused of being accomplices of war crimes, whether by action or by passivity, acting together, the judicial and the media. First, the mainstream media killed the character and destroyed his or her reputation. In the case of Julian, you can see how he was portrayed as a rapist, hacker, narcissist, Russian asset, spy, back house guest, and anything else imaginable. Then the land is ready for judicial abuse. Only in that way is possible that, for example, someone so self-described as media consigliere for global leaders, author, columnist, broadcaster in the UK, Mr. Paul Blanche, who has, of course, never met Julian Assange, publicly said, as long as Assange spends the rest of his life in prison, I don't care what it is for. I am all for due process, etc. Just not with him. Have you ever heard about Mr. Assange? Me neither. But he's not the only one on the side of lies and oppression. Fortunately, for the legal battle against Dover in the courts, Julian has the beginning. However, as said, this is not only a legal fact. That's why it's so important to challenge the mainstream media. Yes, confronting CNN, BBC, or The Guardian, to name some of those who have acted with more impunity, may seem futile. But this is a battle that must be fought. More than a year of challenging The Guardian, my personal complaint for one of the many misleading articles about Julian Assange, titled "Revealed Russia's Christmas Eve secret plot to smuggle Assange out of the UK." My complaint has had a decent response. After a year, when an independent review panel overruling the latest editor and the managing editor has concluded that, taken as a whole, including the headline, the article gives a misleading interpretations to readers. The panel invites The Guardian to issue a clarification that the plan in relation to Mr. Assange's ability to be able to leave the Ecuadorian embassy was not devised or instigated by Russia. And there was nothing illicit about the plan. In my experience, the most futile struggle is the one that does not happen. So every one of us can and should fight from our own code. Lawyers, journalists, DC politicians, they all have an entrenchment from where to fight this war. But the activists like you, who with your perseverance and courage have been supporting Julian all these years outside for 7 years. And now, outside the prison, you are the key players in this war. I was with Julian for 6 years in my embassy, a place which I opened to make of it a refuge, to protect him. I can assure you that you support many for him, the oxygen, the water, the fuel that help him resisting in such adverse conditions. If Julian has sacrificed his freedom for our freedom, the least we can do is keep fighting for him and for his freedom. That's the only thing that will help him resist and win. Thank you.
Our next speaker is his first time speaking to a small child. He's traveled all the way from Hungary to be here tonight. His name is George Lee. He's an author of the book Balls for Peace. He's a teacher at the International School of Budapest, and he's also a regular on the RT flagship Crosstalk. Welcome to the podium. Thank you, George. Thank you.
You know that the mainstream media a non-US citizen, to somebody who has never worked in the United States, who does not publish in the United States, and yet the United States law apparently applies to him, but he doesn't enjoy the United States constitutional protections. So that's a very nice argument. Yeah, well, the law applies to you, but the constitutional protections don't apply. So all of this outrage, again, as pointed out, this extradition, which everybody knows, the extradition law cannot possibly apply to on political grounds. This is international law. This isn't even anything to do with the United States and the United Kingdom. It's international law, which is extradition cannot be conducted on political grounds. So despite all of that, we get sit in the mainstream media. Today, there was an awful lot of coverage because the Judge Barrett's, that's how you pronounce it, remanded Julian in court. This is all written up very excitedly in the number of publications, The Guardian, the New York Times, after the truth. None of the fundamental issues are covered. Now, what is, well, there is a difference between the kind of journalism that Julian Assange practices and the kind of journalism that is practiced in the mainstream media. Julian Assange is doing what journalism is proper decisions in governance. And above all, he provides information about the most fundamental issue, namely when countries go to war. I mean, there's not a more serious issue than that, when countries going to war and the abuses and atrocities that come with war. That's what the journal provides. That is what we expect the media to provide, and that unfortunately is not what the media provide. Because on the contrary, the mainstream media are invariably cheerleaders. You'll remember how the only time the mainstream media in the United States was enthusiastic about Trump was when he launched the two missile attacks on Syria. Then they were just excited by it. They said, now the Trump presidency is finally coming to its own. And one of these discredited reporters talked about his was erotic excitement of seeing missiles being launched against a helpless country. I mean, not to mention the United States, one hand, Syria on the other. You see the inbound force. That is what WikiLeaks has been as far as the mainstream media is concerned, however, they want conflict. They like wars. They like cheerleading. This is what excites them. So it's not surprising that WikiLeaks is really not their cup of tea. And hence, they either ignore it, or, and this is very important because mostly it's often forgotten, that when Julian Assange was arrested in April 2019, much of the US media was excited about it, absolutely delighted about it. The New York Times was very excited about it. Now we're going to get to the bottom of Russiagate. Now we can get the truth out of it. He knows what the truth is. And this is what the mainstream media have now become. They are purveyors of gossip, the agitation for war by all the sort of secret government affairs, cultivate their immediate sources to tell them that we have absolutely corroborated evidence that Assad did this, Putin did that, something else did something else. This is classic what the media do. And so, the contrast, you can't get a sharper contrast between the journalism that is practiced by WikiLeaks and the journalism that we have had over the last few years. I think it's something from 2016, which we know under the rubric of Russiagate. This is all bad habits started in the United States. This whole thing about Russia is behind every single thing that you don't like in the world, that's spread to other countries. The UK has embraced it, Germany's embraced it. But it is based on absolute nothing. And this has been, the media have been playing Russia game with fury. When you think of the limited resources that are now available to the media, that you don't have the money that they once had, and when you think about the man-hours that have been devoted to Russia and how little that has produced, then it is a stunning, absolutely stunning indictment of the media, of how little. I mean, we know the absolute garbage that has been published on Russia. And we've already heard from Catherine about the Guardian story about Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, making regular visits to Julian Assange in Ecuador. It's still on the Guardian website. An absolutely idiotic story that would easily be and the most closely watched embassy in the world. Guardian never provided a shred of evidence for it. There it is, still on the website. And there have been innumerable other cases. I can go through all of them because they're just too joke. One case where both CNN and MSNBC had, they had the scoop of the century, which was that Donald Trump Jr. Knew ahead of time So I had to go around that's it. We had it on September the 4th. Boom! All of the media was absolutely crazy. And then it was a whoops. When we said September the 4th, we actually meant September the 14th, by which time the whole world knew about the Podesta emails. Sorry about that. I know the world media went absolutely crazy. But that was that. And there were other cases. For instance, there was a reporter on ABC News, Brian Ross, who also came recklessly with this sensational story in which he said that Donald Trump had told Michael Flynn before the election to make contact with the Russians. Again, huge sensation, that's it, we got it, that's a collusion with Russia. Then, so he actually said it after the election. I mean, look, it's a small mistake, anyway, could happen. So that's another case. And then, there's another case in January 2017. New York Times ran a huge story, absolutely front page, blockbuster. That the U.S. intelligence now knows for certain that Trump campaign officials repeatedly had contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials throughout the campaign. Now, this story played a big role in the whole Russia game election. It was Peter Strzok. Peter Strzok, the FBI guy who absolutely detests Trump. He was the guy who actually wrote this memo, who actually said, and this is published very recently, he said in this memo, every single thing in this New York Times story is rubbish. And this is just the thing. This is not a person who's a Trump fan. This is for the FBI and every single thing. So, where is the New York Times and the mainstream media? Where are they getting this information? Well, they're getting it from all sorts of this whatever one's feelings about Donald Trump, and there's an awful lot that is talking about Donald Trump, to put it mildly. The problem is that the people who go after Donald Trump go after him for the wrong reasons. These are people who don't like it when he says something like, well, we should maybe not go to Russia, maybe we should try to And so you don't, this story, they cobbled together, the mainstream media cobbled together, that Russia colluded with the Trump campaign to steal the 2016 election. This is the story. This is from 2015, 2016, they've been running with the story. Not one shred of evidence has ever emerged for this. And what's important about this, and here we get to the role of Julian Assange, is that they now fixated on him as having played this crucial role in this. Now, the New York Times regularly publishes absolute false about Julian Assange's role in all of this, in which the New York Times goes further than either the moral and the DOJ. So, for instance, the New York Times claimed very recently said that, well, Mueller wasn't really able to get too far with his investigation of the Hillary Clinton emails because Julian Assange refused to cooperate with the Mueller investigation. Now, of course, anyone really with the minimal knowledge of it said Julian Assange made himself completely available to do this. But again, the newspaper record presented it as though he was similarly, with the New York Times wrote that Julian Assange, this was the time of the arrest, at the time when the New York Times is celebrating Julian Assange's arrest, about Russia's role in the 2016 election. Now, it's very rich there, but you have to remember that the Obama had actually not said what again, these are probably people who are no fans of WikiLeaks, but Obama said, well, WikiLeaks it was a witty or unwitty accomplice of Russia. The Mueller report also said the same thing. So here is the media outlet of the New York Times, which actually goes further than Obama, goes further than the Mueller investigation, in these kind of absolutely baseless accusations against WikiLeaks. So, and this I think is very important, that the media have gone even further than governments that deep state that they're supposed to serve. I mean, they truly are like the sort of attack dogs, the junkyard dogs, they're just there to savage the enemies. Now, this then is the kind of journalism, this mainstream media journalism, of the kind of way we're going to have a lot more of. So that, what's happening to Julian Assange today is going to affect that journalism because we're going to have a lot more of it. If things go badly in the Assange case, and he's silenced forever, we will always have the mainstream media. A nice example of that was last week the publication, when you saw it, by The Atlantic, in which it said that Donald Trump was not a great fan of the U.S. troops. It just wasn't an enthusiastic war. It was more anonymous. And this was held by the media as absolutely representative. Imagine the U.S. president, who is not an enthusiastic war. Imagine that. He actually said, why the hell did the U.S. get involved? This is absolutely horrific for much of the mainstream media, and now spend these something like 10 days on this horrific shock horror story. This is the journalism we're going to get a lot more of. The real journalism, the journalism that exposes war crimes, that exposes above all the specious rationalizations by which countries go to war. That journalism, which is what he bodies by WikiLeaks, that increasingly WikiLeaks and media science. Thank you.
So much, thank you very much, and again, thank you for traveling all the way from Hungary to be here today. Our next speaker is an author, a journalist, a veteran journalist and broadcaster. Mr. Peter O'Gore is the author of, I think, about a dozen books, so thank you very much, Peter O'Gore, and it's first of all, it was a long trial. Thank you.
I'm sure it's got problems. It's also a great newspaper with very distinguished journalists. I simply didn't recognise that. Mad cunt does enormous damage to the cause of Julian Assange to have cranky weirdos attacked. I'm sorry. You're not helping Julian Assange by associating him with conspiracy theories. And I'm here because I think that Mr. Assange has been a victim of gross injustice. I don't want him extradited. I think outrageously is. New York Times. It really isn't. I disassociate myself from the previous speaker, and I was very upset to hear that. Now, I just briefly mentioned the great scripts by this piece of mainstream media, like the MP's expensive scandal by the Daily Telegraph, the phone-hacking investigations by the Guardian, very recently the absolutely sensational wildcard investigation by the Financial Times, David Walsh's investigation into Lance. I'm not defending Andrew Gilligan as journalism, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to listen to my colleagues in the mainstream media traduced the way we just had. It's unacceptable. And it damages Mr. Assange, and it helps him explain why respectable journalists, well-meaning people doing their job, don't want to go there. It's someone who can claim their conspiracy theories. I put in my I know I want to. Yeah, well, I respect that. First of all, I'd like to thank St. Francis Church. Most beautiful building, perfect place to listen to some very thoughtful discussions. Secondly, Great Sharkey, who's really done a wonderful job. And I want to explain why I have come here today. I come here as a journalist, and I'm not a legal expert. I believe in free speech. I believe in how precious it is. And I am extremely critical of our beloved corporate press and the way it's covered with the Assange story. Together to pursue the cause of Boris Johnson on the way to the Tory leadership of Downing Street in an uncritical way, which occluded example of how something which is of grave significance for the trade of journalism has been ignored or misrepresented in the corporate press, and I'm very upset. And I feel ashamed of a lot of the papers which won't go near this subject. But it must be addressed in a fair-minded way. There are, by the way, it's not the case of exhibition, Mr. Hassel, there are criticisms of his journalism, if that's what you want to call it. But certainly, I do accept that Mr. Assange has broken more stories of great gravity what all the rest of us put together. He's not, I was a practicing journalist. I think he's in a category of his own. And he didn't, there are things he didn't do. He didn't go, a normal journalist would go through the fact-checking process, putting stories to everybody, making sure it's all in context. You just release material that should not be released, otherwise much of it is very bad.
Television broadcast interviews with world leaders from the Ecuadorian embassy in a show called The World Tomorrow, the likes of which David Frost committed for. He is a journalist.
Now, I want to. I do agree very much with the points made by several of the speakers that on dissidents held in countries which are hostile to the war, held to be enemies of the West, it doesn't look in the same way at dissidents in this country. And the most notable example at the moment is Mr. Assange. Gary Elected, quite rightly, is the subject of great discussion and campaigning in the British media. I want to look at one or two less well-known examples, taking about Gulanov, 36-year-old freelance journalist, arrested after what looks like, I think, had drugs planted in his apartment, wrote for the Russian news outlet Medusa. Famous for his investigation, very brave, unbelievably brave investigations into local corruption, thought to have been framed by Moscow businessmen. When he was arrested, there was a huge public outcry. In Russia, the Russian press absolutely came out in his mainstream papers in Russia, questioned the legality of Gulanov's arrest, demanding investigation into the actions of the police. This is Russia talking about. Yet the UK press seems unable to do the same to Assange. And whose stories were, I think, more important, much, even admirable to the world. And this case will have a profound effect on press freedom. Or look at Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition leader, started out by exposing corruption that evolved into criticisms of the state, led Navalny to attempt to stand against Putin, jailed for embezzlement, and he was politically motivated, released following a judgment of the Russian Supreme Court, convicted again last month, allegedly poisoned with knowledge. Reports today say that Germany has threatened to abandon its joint underwater gas pipeline project with Russia if Moscow doesn't start cooperating in an investigation into the poisoning of Mr. Navalny. Where are we having the comparable weight put behind support for Mrs. Assange? That's the question. ask. Or look at Yang Hengzhu, I apologize if I have probably too. Chinese academic, former diplomat in China, wrote spy novels. Held in China since January 2019, even though he became an Australian citizen 20 years ago. And his lawyers claim that China has attempted to break it with daily interrogations, espionage charges. Well, there is support in Australia, quite heavy support. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, says that Australia has to stand up for our citizens. Mr. Morrison says that he's deeply concerned by the treatment of Yang. He calls the allegations absolutely untrue. Says that his officials have lobbied China for his release. In comparison, last year, Mr. Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, it did confirm that Australia was providing consular assistance for Julian Assange following the arrest in London, but will give no special treatment to find the release. I just wonder whether Australia could try a bit harder to look after one of its most famous journalists. In the name of free speech, let's just imagine, finally, that there was a Chinese dissident held in Belmarsh. Let's imagine that there were massive issues about you. He exposed war crimes of the Chinese state, many of them. Let's imagine that the Chinese wanted him back, where he would serve on espionage charges which looked fabricated. And he was going to serve 175 years in jail. Imagine the outrage. Imagine the outrage in the British place if this was happening. You would never hear the end of it. Prime Minister's question splashes in the Sun newspaper day after day. Prime Minister of Britain would be humiliated. So quite he wouldn't do so otherwise for the security of his Chinese. And that is why I do think there's a very brave double standard. I absolutely think that it changes British journalism. That's why all of us are here tonight.
Thank you, George. That's an example of imperialism. We don't always agree on everything here, and we welcome speakers who have differences of opinion. So we're going to come to the second half, which is going to be a question time hosted by Ian Clark. Known as an author, journalist, and broadcaster, and he's regular contributor on our. So we need to know who's figure any other thing sometimes.
Good evening, everybody. I want to sort of give the impression that sort of the David Dinglery and Peter Lavelle here. So I haven't got both sides of the argument about it, anyway, I'll do my best. Now, the title of this evening, and thank you again for everybody for coming tonight. The title of this event is, I think it's Free Human Astronomy Period of Trial. So I'm going to be putting questions to this very distinguished panel. We've seen your summary, it's overall been introduced. The person who hasn't been introduced yet is Mr. Peter, the former British ambassador to Syria. And so thank you very much for Peter and the rest of you coming tonight. So what I would want to ask, first of all, to the panel, who started putting work down, question that remember 4 years ago, there was a lot of debate about Trump versus Clinton, and if you like the anti-war, divided into being an option. Quite a few of the actual thought perhaps Trump might be a better option because of the ability of hawk on foreign policy, think back to the Yugoslavia war, think back to Libya, Secretary of State, and not unreasonably many of the anti-imperialism. Trump, remember Trump, the man who was after all, he said that he tried to bring troops back and he would adopt a more isolationist stroke, non-interventionist foreign policy. And, well, everybody's got their own mind as to how that worked out. The fact is that whether we like it or loathe it, there haven't been any major new wars that the US has started in the Trump presidency. We mentioned previous speakers the bombing of Syria. I think George mentioned that in his speech when we talked about that the early time when his enemies were cheering, saying what a good president, and talking about the rocket experiences when he bombed Syria. And we all know how 2020 began. It seems a long time ago now, doesn't it? The start of 2020. It began not with COVID or coronavirus, it began with the Iran crisis, with the murder and assassination of the General Sirleaf a long time ago now. It's still only this year, believe it or not, that was probably Trump's most aggressive part of bombing Syria. But of course, he did lead to war. Now, the question I want to ask the distinguished panel is, well, whether they think whether Trump was better than Clinton in retrospect, and whether President Clinton will be in power today, will the US election in November make, first of all, any difference to the plight of Julian Assange, and will it make any significant difference to US foreign policy if Biden or Trump wins? So, we'll come back to you on that question.
Thank you. I will try to answer that question. First, I want to make a general point. It's still happening. The terrible situation described in WikiLeaks archives is still going on. Here we are, all these years later, and I hope that the race behind all the disclosures. Remember, it seems an age ago now, but the world stopped on its axis for a moment. It was so that in activism, the disclosures, the time with the revulsion after the war, there was a sense
Mike.
I don't know if it's working.
Is this?
Yeah.
So, I'm making, at the time of the WikiLeaks disclosure, there were high hopes that things would change, but they haven't. It's still happening. The interference, the bullying, is still happening. If anything, it's worse. There have been hopes after the Iraq War, with the disclosures, with the revelations about how civilians were being mowed down by helicopter gunships, including Reuters correspondents in Iraq. Hundreds of civilians were killed, and the failures of the war in about every country on the planet, except those countries which were either satellites or which were willing to kowtow to the American hegemon. For a brief moment, Julian was the man of the moment, the man of the year, the hero, lion. And yet here we are, his glory, his detention, and the prospect of indefinite incarceration. The Western powers have been quite clever over the last 10 years. They've dialed down on more overt warmongering, it seems. They've not been able to ignore the general revulsion against the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, but they used more proxies, and they used they developed other forms of warfare, info war, information warfare, psyops, and economic war, sanctions have proliferated immensely and do even more damage than bombs. The bombs that fell on Syria did nothing like the damage currently being done by American sanctions. According to a new report by the UN, over half of Syria's population is destitute, and yet it's at this moment that the United States has chosen to turn the screw with a new rat of draconian sanctions called the so-called Caesar Act. At this moment of COVID pandemic as well. And do we read in The Guardian how horrible it is to impose suffering on civilians? Not a word. But to turn to the question, and God knows we might pray for that in the abstract if there's any prospect of the new regime being any different, but I honestly don't believe there is. I think the Trump period has been an illustration that even a president who breaks the mold in many ways, who wants to, possibly for the wrong reasons, but who wants to dial down on warmongering, bring the troops home, is stymied at almost every step to withdraw US troops from Syria. But very transparently, he was stymied by the machine, by the military industrial establishment of Eisenhower, drew attention to all those years ago. And nothing changed, and nothing will change here, whoever is the next American president.
It's an axiom of the foreign policy. I'm sorry. It is an axiom of the foreign policy of Washington that not one single American soldier can be withdrawn from any country at any time, ever. We can't even withdraw any troops from Germany. 75 years after the war, the American troops will stay in Germany. There can be no withdrawal of troops from Syria. The moment that there's any kind of talk of basically Trump said, finally signed an agreement with the Taliban, we can be out of there. There's a barrage of newspaper stories. The Russians have put a bounty on American servicemen's head. Right away, when I was in the debate straight, well, we can't possibly withdraw from Afghanistan because that's playing Putin's game. So, sorry, we have to stay on, because otherwise Putin, the terrible Putin, will be celebrated. The same goes in Syria. Trump will start talking about withdrawing from Syria. What becomes the story that they're weeping about the imminent genocide of the Kurds, apparently the greatest fighters that the world has ever seen. What becomes the story? The story becomes, of course, that Trump is playing Putin's game. So it's the kind of down in theology. You withdraw your troops anywhere, you are playing Putin's game. It's a nice little trick. Now, to answer your question as to what do you make it different? Well, I get to think that probably it would be even worse. The Hillary Clinton presidency would have certainly got into some very nasty and dangerous confrontation with Russia. And I think it might well happen under a Biden presidency. I mean, I think these people are absolutely crazy on something with Russia, and I think that something very unpleasant could well happen. On the other hand, Trump has his own beast in his bonnet. He's got a beast in his bonnet about Iran. He's got a beast in his bonnet about Venezuela. And the second term of the Trump presidency could well aggravate both of those Brexit. So I'm not at all sure Trump is giving up on trying to put around. Yeah, exactly. It's just that the difference is Democrats and Republicans have slightly different priorities. Yeah, exactly. The Democrats are more in these countries, Republicans are more in those countries. But otherwise, the same thing. We want American identity, global supremacy, wherever. That's an interesting thing, which is that I do think that if Trump loses, I think he may just simply want to screw the Democrats over, because he knows that the Democrats are really against this time. And I can see him just doing the kind of spiteful thing. He's already hinted that he might pardon Snowden, and I think that he might just do that basically. Sorry? Yeah, just.
You said
it's saying, okay, you Democrats, it's just trying to screw the Democrats over as much as exactly. I think that's best hope.
I agree with George. I think one of the big differences was Trump's undoing the Iran deal of the previous president. A terrible thing to do, and completely barbaric in total betrayal of international law. And there is a chance, I think, that Biden might try and give us a way back into the JCP era. Paul would know more than me about that. The other big difference, of course, was the moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. I don't think that would have happened under a Democratic leader, maybe I'm wrong. And I did like the fact, the great thing which made us a little bit hopeful, ghastly and appalling at Trump, it was the aversion to war. And he hasn't started any, is that right? He's not started any, not the signal, but we should look also at the domestic situation in the United States. I find Trump's entertaining of white supremacist, fascist forces really awful. I still hold, probably nobody else does in this room, I still hold out that the United States is a virtuous nation. And Trump is the attack on the institutions, assault on the rule of law, his naked racism and stoking up domestic hatred. I think is quite disgusting, and I pray to God to check Biden wins.
I just wanted to follow up there.
I think it's often the way he is characterized. He certainly has his problems. However, a lot of it is, before this talk about his threat to the Constitution, it hasn't materialized. He has adhered to all the Supreme Court rulings. He's won some, he lost some. He has never challenged the courts. He hasn't even harassed the press as much as your Obama administration harassed the press. I mean, just because he kicks out some White House correspondent for a couple of hours, I don't think that's really what we mean by a real threat to the press. So, there's plenty wrong with Trump, but we need to get it right.
Peter, you might comment about the Iranian position, because people were saying about Iran and Biden may go back into the international agreements. How do you think it might develop with Iran next year?
Of course, it depends whether Trump is re-elected or whether it's divided. If Trump is re-elected, then I would expect him to pursue his strategy of bringing Iran to the negotiating table, effectively seeking cognitive changes to the original agreement, which would allow it effectively to be implemented, and maybe Trump will feel more liberated from the establishment and be able to get away with that. There is, if it was Biden, then yes, I would expect him to try to go back to the Obama course. Whether he will be allowed by the establishment remains to be seen. But in the meanwhile, I think it's important that we look at how things have changed since that the POA is called Obama-Iran agreement early autumn. Changed it quite radically, I believe. And it showed, to my mind, that Iran had the upper hand. Iran, although they lost the general, Soleimani, they got what they wanted. Well, I think that what they wanted was to be able to continue to export their oil. The Americans were trying to prevent that under their policy of maximum pressure. And quietly, the Iranians haven't got off with exporting their oil. And quietly, the Americans have done nothing about it. This is the reality. And there is an argument that can be made when you look at the example of North Korea. The point is that you don't hear about North Korea. North Korea succeeded in deterring the United States, very close to having a serious nuclear threat. And there is an argument that can be made that the Middle East will not be safe until Iran reaches a similar position to North Korea. I'll leave you with that thought.
We will be having questions from the audience later, so we're going to please stay around if you've got any questions to ask. I just wanted to follow up on that point, what Peter said about Syria. Where are we now in regards the kind of neocon regime change project? Obviously, backing rebels, so-called moderate rebels, that's either there. President Assad still in power. Is there any chance that if the Democrats win, they will go back big time to trying down the road again, or try to back rebels again? Are we going to see it repeat that, or are we going to see just this vacation you described with the sanctions being tightened? What's the end game? What do they actually want? Just to sort of destroy Syria economically and have a very wounded Syria?
town or it's ludicrous even to describe it. No one really believes it. But there is this policy of maximum pressure, particularly through these very, very severe sanctions, which are even more severe than those that were applied to Iraq and the people of Syria who were paid. I don't see quite how either a Biden administration or a Trump administration could dial back on these failed policies. There are moves afoot on the left of American politics to become a bit more sensible about Syria. People are seeing the failure and immorality of sanctions on Syria. I'm not very hopeful. I would expect a continuation of the status quo. But Syria has a history of resilience and survival, and the sanctions will not make Syria possible.
Peter, can I just ask Peter, you've been in Syria, Peter, you've been in Syria, I went to a couple of times, haven't you, in the last 5 years. What's your reading of the situation? How are things going to pan out there in the next 2 or 3 years? Are they going to go back to a more aggressive regime change? Have they given up on that, do you think? Or as Peter said, is going to be this sort of sacrifice punishment by sanctions?
Peter Ford is so learned on this subject, I agree with him entirely about sanctions. I think they're immoral, they're stupid and vindictive. I take it that the presence in the remaining military presence of the West, the Americans, and who else is there? It's about oil, isn't it? Is it? I think that the question I ask myself is the sanction regime which causing such horror in Syria, how much longer will the United States be able to enforce that kind of, have that power to use the dollar effectively and military might to stop Syria trading with the rest of the world? What we're seeing at the moment not just in the Middle East, elsewhere, is a new world order emerging where China and Russia are much more profound forces, and Pakistan, Iran, Syria, China is becoming and Russia a much more powerful voice in those countries. And I ask myself, I don't know what Peter said, would say, how much longer has America got the financial and military muscle to maintain this immoral stranglehold of the Syrian people?
And I greatly fear it can go on a long while yet. I do agree that changes are afoot in the whole superstructure of geopolitics, and eventually China will build an alliance with countries like Russia and Iran. But economically, the dollar is still top dog and will be for the foreseeable future. And while that situation continues, America will have a head start over the rest of the world. But if you're talking 10-year tense, 20-year tense, yes, but in the meanwhile, the Syrian economy will buckle even more than it is. Syria and the oil, actually, although Trump appears keen on the oil, I think using that more as an excuse or a way of pleasing one of his donors. The value of Syria's oil is pitiful. The the main value of it is depriving Syrian government of it within itself. It's not worth very much.
Right, I now want to sort of talk more about the West-Russia relations. Question on last panel, question about that. I've written a lot about the so-called gas wars going on. We know that the Germans and the Russians working on the Nord Stream gas pipeline. We know that the US is not very happy with this because the US wants to sell LNG, its gas to Europe. They've got a big facility in Poland. They're doing that. And there have been attempts by the US to kind of kibosh side that German, Russian. Yeah, so we've got this gas war fight that's been going on, and it's back in the news again with the events of the last week or so, with the Navalny situation, with the alleged poisoning, the alleged Novichok poisoning, and I think Peter was who said that there was calls tonight for Germany to cancel that, and there's certainly pressure on Germany to cancel that Nord Stream gas pipeline with Russia. How does the panel then two? How does the panel think that one will pan and much detail on the value? I've followed this story very closely, and I know how much the state and how much the US does want to, and gas interests, they want to sabotage basically the Nord Stream pipeline. How are things going to pan out here? Will Germany buckle to this pressure? Will Germany walk away from this? Will they yield to the American pressure on this? Or is there, in Germany itself, is the if you like, the national interest lobby too strong?
Well, this is, for the Americans, it's a very big deal. They've been agitating about the